Good morning. Thanks for coming back on the third day, and I know it's early, but I think this is going to be a lively discussion, and I'm looking forward to getting the rest of the audience involved as we go forward. My name is Summer Mathis. I'm editor of the Atlantic Cities, which is the online magazine from the American magazine, The Atlantic, dedicated to global cities and urban affairs. I launched the Atlantic Cities along with my colleague Richard Florida, who you heard from yesterday, just a little over 2 years ago, because we saw a great need to tell the stories of the hard work that cities are engaged in, improving the lives of their citizens. And what we've learned since then is that not only is there an expert audience that is interested in many of the topics we write about at the Atlantic Cities, such as yourselves, but that there's also a great general interest audience. There's a huge amount of growth with our readership over the last couple of years, and I think that's a real testament to really the amount of interest in just people who live in cities are deeply interested in the work that is being done with companies and governments and all the folks who are here. So, I can tell you from our experience with launching this relatively young website that the work that we're all discussing here at sort of an expert level is deeply fascinating and interesting and important for regular people who just want to read about what we're talking about here today. So, the other thing that I can tell you is that the number one topic on our website is transportation. It is what I kind of call the great equalizer in terms of that difference between the expert audience and the general interest audience, because everyone has to get to work, everyone has to get to school, everyone has to get from here to there, and it's a topic that really incites a lot of passions among our readers, among the people who leave comments on our website. And so I'm really thrilled to be moderating this morning's session, which is titled Mobility for Innovative Cities. The Expo has defined this panel this way, but I'll kind of amend that slightly. We'll be looking both inside and outside the box on the issue of urban mobility and gridlock. What should government agendas be considering at this point as we strive toward a more efficient and sustainable model for urban mobility? I'll quickly outline some of the goals that I'm hoping we'll be able to discuss this morning. We'll be looking at some of the political, infrastructural, technological obstacles to improving mobility in the context of the smart city. What are the goals? We should be defining those, for that matter. If our aims are to reduce automobile congestion and we succeed, are we simply inducing demand for more cars to be on the roads of our smarter and more efficient roads? What is the role of mass transit, and what are the differences that we can look at between the developing world and the developed world in terms of where we're headed, in terms of the culture of car ownership, of our feelings about the reliability of public transportation. So I'll go ahead and introduce our panel. At the far end, we have Mohinder Singh, who is the Dean of the LTA Academy at the Land Transport Authority of Singapore, which is an organization responsible for research, training, and knowledge exchange on land transport policy and planning in Singapore. Next to him is David Bragdon, the Executive Director of Transit Center, which is a non-governmental organization that provides research and promotes the use of public transportation. He also served 8 years as the president of the Metro Council, which is the only directly elected regional planning agency in the United States. Next we have Dario Hidalgo, who is the Director of Research and Practice in the Sustainable Transport and Urban Development Program at EMBARQ. He lives in Bogota and is trained as a civil engineer. Next, we have Owen Poole from the Thales group in France. Owen is the marketing director for transport and security activities at the Thales group. Next, we have Alejandro Pérez Candela from Indra here in Spain. He is responsible for the traffic and transportation units in the Smart Cities platform at Indra. And then lastly, we have Jorge Estévez San Román, who is the CEO for Iberia here in Spain, and also, of course, Portugal and Morocco at Thyssenkrupp Elevator. So, Mohinder, let's start with you. We're talking about reducing congestion, and I want to kind of give everyone a chance to introduce themselves, but obviously Singapore has a lot of lessons to share in its experience in the policies and initiatives that have been rolled out there. So why don't you tell us a little bit about where your background and what Singapore has to share?
Certainly, yes. Thank you, Soma, and good morning to all of you. I'm very happy to be here. I'm very happy to be in this beautiful city of Barcelona, and of course in this panel this morning to exchange views with you about this important topic of mobility. Now, I come from a small place pretty well on the other side of the world. It's the city of Singapore, and I come from the Land Transport Authority of Singapore, which is a single authority that looks after all aspects of land transport in Singapore, right from policy planning down to implementation, except for the operation of the public transport system, which is operated by private operators. Now, personally, I have been involved in Singapore's land transport journey over the last 30 plus years. So it's something from the 1970s when we were a small island, just practically starting to live. And maybe a few words about Singapore. We have today a population of about 5.5 million people on a land area of about 700 square kilometers. So one of the things that particularly influences not only transport development, but also in general urban development in Singapore is our land, or rather the limited size of our land. So many of the policies that we did actually based on that. So for instance, in the early studies, we actually mapped out how Singapore would urbanize. In that time, most of our people used to stay in slums in around the core of the city with very little development outside. So we needed a plan, we needed a master plan to try and see how we would urbanize Singapore in a sensible way, and that would guide development over the next 30, 40 years. And well, learning from experience elsewhere, we were a late starter. We became a nation in 1965. So by around 1970, when we first started developing our plan, learning from the experience elsewhere, we realized a couple of things, and that's the beauty of being a late starter. One, private motoring, we realized cannot be the mobility solution for Singapore. We needed to look beyond that. And two, we needed an integrated mobility policy based on public transport as the backbone of our transport development. So the trajectory then taken by Singapore will, over the next 30, 40 years, then focus on a few key things. One was to try and integrate transport and land use planning. Now, we all know that transport shapes cities in many ways. I mean, we heard of the sessions yesterday, how the cities of the earlier 18th century, 19th century were really walking cities. They were based on walking. And then along came the trains, and then the train system shaped cities. And of course, in the 20th century, we had the motor car, and the motor car then shaped cities very considerably, particularly in the place where it started booming very much, which was the US of A. And then, so there was a lot of car-centric model being developed, and then we wanted to move away from that because of the recognition of our limited land. The other aspect we focused very closely on was the developing an integrated, high-quality public transport system. And that has been something which has been a cornerstone of Singapore's land transport policy development, again, over the last 30, 40 years. And huge investments have been made in both the MRT infrastructure, the bus infrastructure, etc. And thirdly, and this is something which we also paid close attention to right from very early days, that was to, while we could develop the public transport infrastructure, it was to try and manage private transport demand. And we did it in a couple of ways. One was to moderate the increase in car ownership through a number of instruments, which I can talk about later. And the second one was to congestion pricing, charge for road usage. And we started that out with a relatively manual, primitive system in 1975, where we cordoned off the city area. And then subsequently, as the technology developed in 1998, we then moved over to electronic road pricing system. So that has been the trajectory taken by Singapore. And I would think that I would stop there, and we can engage in a discussion later. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm definitely looking forward to talking a little bit more about moderating private car ownership and Singapore's experience there. I think that's kind of one of the big questions we'll be tackling this morning. David, over to you. Obviously, one thing I neglected to mention when I introduced you is that David's also the former long-term planning director for the City of New York. But I think your experience on the Metro Council is perhaps even more informative for this morning's discussion in terms of looking at regional planning and your experience in terms of mass transit and at a regional level too. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what your experience has been?
Sure, really happy to be here. Actually, I learned yesterday, is this on? Number 2?
Are we having some microphone?
Numero dos. Hey, there we go.
There
Well,
we go.
in terms of my background, I learned something very interesting yesterday, and that Richard Florida and I have something in common, in addition to our love of cities, is that coincidentally each of us first set foot in the city of Barcelona in the year 1985. And I had a backpack on my back and your rail pass after college, tromping around Europe. And I have to say, since 1985, I would like to think I've aged as well and gracefully as Barcelona has. The growth here and everything that's happened here, quite tremendous. But as Summer mentioned, I am now in the nonprofit sector, non-governmental sector, with an organization that does research and advocacy around public transit. But for the previous nearly 15 years, spent my time in government in 2 very different cities in the United States. And it's really very difficult to generalize about the United States, but I was president of the Metro Council in Portland, Oregon, and then spent 2 years as director of long-term planning for the Mayor Bloomberg's administration in New York City. Of course, there was a very, very different context, New York City being an established urban center. In fact, the second half of the 20th century, the population was declining in New York City, whereas the West Coast, Portland, much younger, smaller, medium-sized city. But I think there are some generalities, some universal principles about transportation that are important, whether we're talking about developed countries or developing countries, medium-sized cities or large cities. It's tempting to say, actually, about the United States to other countries, well, you should just very, very carefully study what the United States did in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, and then just do the opposite, and you'll be fine. But I think there's some more nuanced advice that I'd like to give. First, 3 points, but the first would be that transportation planning is really indivisible from community planning. That is not the first time you've heard that from this stage this week. Kent Larson, if you remember from MIT, he gave several points for what makes for a smart city, and the very first one he mentioned was arrange that community so that people can satisfy their needs in a small area, the 20-minute walk. You heard Amitabh Kant that same afternoon on the same stage saying transportation and the community planning go together. He said if Barcelona was laid out in the way that Atlanta is laid out, it would be impossible to serve, and that's very true. So that is something that Portland did very well, recognized very early in its development in the 1970s planning period, of recognizing that the plans to conserve farmland and to revitalize the urban area have to go hand in hand with the transportation investment. The transportation is there to serve the city, not the other way around. Secondly, and I say this to my colleagues in the transit industry, is that we often focus on supply and you look at the displays in the Expo, it's about new systems, it's about the cars, the equipment, the rolling stock, the signalization, the supply, the infrastructure. We also need to be looking at the demand. How do we manage the demand? How do we help people to avoid trips altogether by the way we plan the communities? How do we manage the demand through pricing and other sorts of creative means? Transportation has a lot to learn from the energy efficiency. It's been a real pleasure for me as a transportation person to be able to go to the energy sessions yesterday and the day before. In the energy field, they recognized a long time ago that if you can avoid building new generating capacity by reducing the demand, that's actually financially a much better deal than building new generating capacity. Similar principle ought to apply in transportation. Increasingly, we do realize that. And the third, and I think this is also an important trend, is the recognition of the individual, of the passenger, of the customer, and how that person has different sorts of needs at different parts of times of the day, different times of life. And we in the people in the transit industry are often think about our trains, our buses, and the person appears there. Well, the person has to get to the bus and is a pedestrian on the way. The person may not ride the bus 5 days a week because one day of those week needs to go shopping. And so having access to urban mobility that is car-free through the other modes of transportation, whether it's bike share, car share, is also important. All those need to work together, whether they're public or private.
All right, thank you. I think that's a great point too, and we'll come back to that. The sort of the increased focus or the need for one on the role of the passenger and their input, and being more collaborative with passengers as customers, as citizens, and in planning and in transportation use. Dario, I'd love to hear from you. You've got a civil engineer background, so I'm sure you're going to have kind of a slightly different point of view, but also a South American point of view. So tell us a little bit about where your point of view on what the big issues are in terms of mobility for what is truly innovative at this year, at this point in time, from your perspective.
Well, what it is very difficult right now is to move from the prevailing paradigm, which was created in the 20th century, in which the car was we moved cities around the car, moved cars around the city, and not about the access of the people. And well, I went to school in the United States, and I went to school on the supply side type of approach, in which is just predict how many cars will be on the road and create a capacity for those cars. And there's a lot of industry and interest behind that. It's not just the automakers, it's the financial system, it's the housing system, it's the road construction industry. So we kind of get locked into a trajectory which is non-sustainable at this point of our planet. And so we need to really shift from that, but it's very difficult because of all this interest that is behind. We in the World Resources Institute, and particularly in the Sustainable Transport Program EMBARQ, work with this acronym of ASI, which means Avoid, Shift, Improve, which is a way to understand the concepts behind mobility from the demand side and the supply side perspective at the same time. Avoid the need for long trips, mainly motorized trips, shift to the most sustainable modes, which is walking first, biking, public transportation, and improve the technologies and the operations of the systems. And we have here in the panel people that works on that, on providing the technology to improve. But we need to work very, very hard at the top end. And in Latin America and the rest of the world, I had the opportunity also to work a lot on India. Well, the rise of the middle class is creating a real challenge for all of us. And it's that the middle class is aspiring to move in an independent way, and that's buying a motorcycle first or buying a four-wheeler, as they say in India, a car second, and for many, many families is the first car. So there's a lot of aspiration in there, but there's no room to build the roads, and there's no opportunity to build your way out of congestion. I heard from Lou Fulton, which was in the International Energy Agency and now working with UC Davis, a tale that really stuck in my head. It says if you try to solve congestion by building roads, is the same than trying to solve obesity by expanding the size of your pants. And that's something that has not worked for me, has not worked for many people, and unfortunately, it's the supply side solution. So that changing paradigm, it's very difficult to get. We are working hard. The international development organizations like the World Bank, UN Habitat just published this year the global report on human settlements based on mobility and trying to change the mindset. But that change of mindset of the supply side is really hard to get. We keep working on that. We have, fortunately, really great examples here in Europe, this extraordinary city of Barcelona, but also places like Copenhagen or Amsterdam, so recently London with the congestion pricing improvement in transit there. And we had also examples like Singapore, which is one of these things that we study to try to find ways to adapt to our own situation. And now in Latin America, my own city, Bogota, was able to build an extraordinary mass transit network based on buses. In the last 10 years, 105 kilometers moving 2 million people every day, which is, for my city, has been extraordinary. And you see Mexico City, you see Rio de Janeiro building 150 kilometers of BRT. So there are things happening, and we just need to be optimistic about how to adapt these good solutions that have in some part a smart technology, but are mainly about access, affordability, and sustainability.
Thank you. I think there are a couple of things I'm going to pull out that we'll definitely come back to, but we talked a little bit about managing demand earlier, and now I think definitely have a sense that we need to discuss this tension between managing demand and managing supply on the supply side, and then of course the rise of the middle class in much of the developing world and what that means in terms of, and it means a lot, I think, about where we're headed in managing private car ownership. Owen, over to you. So you're coming from experiences in France and the UK. Tell us a little bit about the Thales Group and your work there in terms of transport and security.
Yes, thank you, and thank you for inviting me to speak here. It's great to be in Barcelona again. I'm English, as you can tell. I live in Paris. I've been living there since 3 years. I've worked for 14 years in Thales. I'm in charge at the moment of marketing for our transport and security solutions based in Paris. And of course, smart city, transport, smart mobility, it's a subject of major interest for us. And I think we're very much a solution side solution. We talk about supply side solutions. I think we're here to give you solutions to some of the issues that we're facing today. Thales is a worldwide business. We're present in 56 countries, 1,300 people here in Spain, and we've been working with cities for over 25 years. 30 or so cities worldwide, including many of the cities mentioned by yourself, Dario. Amsterdam, in fact the whole of Holland, we're providing all of the systems for ticketing there for multimodal transport. We're present in Mexico as well. Transport is a very important component of our business, and we're, just to run through the shopping list of what we do, it's signaling, it's supervision systems, ticketing systems. We do traffic management solutions for road, fleet management for buses, trams, and that's a broad portfolio of industrial capability. What that gives us, though, is a unique overview of how we can start to look at these individual bricks, if you will, or components of the transport mix, and start actually to take a more systematic view of how we can bring those together, looking at rebalancing perhaps the public-private transport mix and seeing whether we can encourage shifts in behaviour. I believe if people have more confidence in the public transport, then people make more use of it. And we've seen that where we work with cities to put in place transportation management systems that can actually give a priority to public transport, we see a slow increasing use of that public transport, and that's what the city is trying to achieve as part of its agenda and part of its policy for transport over the long term. I think there's some important aspects and some of the questions that have been asked of me over the past 3 days. 2 points I'd like to sort of bring to the table, really. We talk a lot about open systems and open architectures. That's great. It sounds very technical, sounds very complicated. And of course, these are technical concepts. But I think we need to step back a little bit and think what those mean for people, for buyers, for customers, operators, and cities. Because open systems also means being open in how you implement those systems for transportation, how you allow access for future operators, future suppliers, and how as a transport authority you can assure some sort of future growth, future potential, and enable still competitiveness through your future acquisition processes. And open systems provided by industry players can help you to enable that and still be in a position where you can make some open choices in the future. Don't get locked into suppliers and locked into industry players. I think just coming back to what I said about rebalancing the public-private transport mix, we think about the use of cars as being the private component. We think about the use of, let's say, buses or trains as being the sort of public component. There are other alternatives, and cars can also include electric vehicles. Public could also include bicycle hire. And what we've seen is where we broaden the mix, where cities actually open up the transport mix. Citizens do make choices, make alternative choices based on the broader offer available to them and the increasing confidence they have that if I take a bus instead of taking my car, it will be on time, it will arrive on time, and therefore I'll keep on doing that to get to work rather than taking my car. All the information we sort of take from the transport network and churn around our open systems, let's do what we can as well to push that information back out again to citizens, because I sort of feel that if we give citizens choices, informed choices, then actually it helps people to make choices they want to make rather than being locked into the current sort of modus operandi. So that's really our position as an industry player. We're here to enable a broader range of solutions for transport and help people make choices.
Thank you. I think that's such a great point. My experience is I've been living in Washington, D.C. for the last 9 years, but for the last about 4 or 5 years, that what your point about the sort of blurring of the public transportation and private transportation has really been playing out for me personally. So I just the extraordinary expansion of choices that I now have, most of which I can control on my smartphone. Of how I'm going to get from one place to another in a single city is something I think we'll definitely want to talk about. Alejandro, so your work at Indra in traffic and transportation perfectly aligns with the Smart City Expo because you're working on the Smart Cities platform there. So tell us a little bit about Indra's point of view at this point on how the smart city fits into everything we've been discussing so far.
So good morning, everyone. First of all, I wanted to apologize Eduardo Bonet, our Deputy Executive Vice President. He should be here, but a change in agenda this morning. He have to fly out of Barcelona, so he's apologized. Indra is a technological company, so we help people, we help governments in order to put the right technology in order to help people. When I started 12 years ago working in the public and transportation world, the traffic problems were a problem in the big cities, and technology was just applicable to these old cities. In these 10 years, this problem has been growing up, and the technology is now applicable to every city. So I wanted to make the difference between the two models. The USA model, so how cities were growing in the 60s, and the developing model. So the cities have been following the USA model. Now have a problem. This city are already saturated of traffic. So in order to make possible a better management of the traffic, our challenge as company is to convince people in order to leave the private car at home in order to make possible a better public transportation. And in order to make this challenge possible, we provide the technology in order to organize in a better way, that people can plan his travel in the city and know exactly when they have to leave home in order to arrive to work at the right hour. So in the developing world, I think we have to help people in order to the challenge to know the vision how are going to be the cities from here to 20 years. I think this was the error, for example, in the USA, the people has not imagined which problem they are going to have nowadays. So our vision as company is to put this technology in order to help people to imagine, to solve the problems they have nowadays, but also to put technology in order to solve the problem they are going to have in 20 years. For example, we have in the smart city concept, I think we have to put the focus in the citizen. We have built cities thinking of cars, thinking in moving cars, but not in moving people, in moving citizens. Our challenge in the smart city work is to put technology in the people with the purpose of people can adapt this technology in order to cover his needs. Just working on the needs of people. And every citizen in a city is able to plan what he wants to do. And for example, in Spain, I think we have to help people to make this cultural change. Smart cities are a cultural change, a change of mentality. People nowadays is able to go from home to the work all with car, and we cannot offer a better public transportation in people is not implied in this change. So we have to provide technology in order to be able to change this mentality in people to make possible reduce congestion in promoting public transportation.
Okay, thank you. Jorge, over to you. So Thyssenkrupp, what is its interest in this topic? We talked a little bit before we came in about this sort of last mile problem in solving some of these mobility issues. I take it that's a pretty big factor for your work.
Yeah. Thank you, Summer. Well, first of all, it's a pleasure for us to be here in this Smart City Congress, also in Barcelona, which is a city, I think it's an example that will be brought into the conversation because of solutions that we have here. We are a kind of people mover industry. We have here a variety of experts and operators, and also the industrial side. We are in the equipment side, which has been blamed somehow here, and I think we can be a part of the solution. Our focus in smart cities is how can we contribute to make essentially public transportation more attractive and more efficient. For this, we have a lot of challenges Because when we talk about smart cities, I think we have to distinguish about a lot of cities types, at least for people mover company as we are. We have to bring solutions into new cities, Masdar, all these nice projects that are here, very nice to see and very fancy, in which you can invent a lot of new things. But also you have to deal with cities like Barcelona with very specific needs, with rehabilitation problems, and the solutions are quite different. On the other hand, we are facing challenges, I would say, in the vertical side, in the eastern cities, vertical cities made of towers, or even towers that are by themselves real cities here. The challenge here is not so much moving a lot of people, but maybe moving less people, but in very short time. So really, when we are talking about a tower of maybe 1 kilometer height, speed is an issue. State-of-the-art technology today is around 10 meters per second. That's something that we can do today, 10, 12 meters per second. But the next frontier will be 20 meters per second, which is twice what we have today. When we're talking about something going into a tube at 20 meters per second, then you are facing problems in mechanics, in materials, in electronics, and even in aerodynamics. So this is a very specific challenge that we are addressing right now. But if you go on the other side, let's say more western cities, then you have horizontal problems that you have to manage. And then here you have a different story. It's more related to moving a lot of people during long distances rather than speed. So here the horizontal challenge is to find ways of connecting these systems, these transportation, people mover systems, to public infrastructure systems. And then comes the last mile concept. You can have a very nice and efficient public transportation system, but if people have to move, to walk more than 200, 300 meters, then you can face a problem, because this will, in some times, due to weather condition or the relief of the city, this can be, let's say, make less attractive the public transportation. So how the equipment companies can act as a kind of feeder of people, driving people to the bus station or to the railway station. I think for this we have solutions that we can discuss later on, like TurboTrack or some other things. There are also horizontal challenges, I would say, like energy consumption, which of course we have to reduce, but we can even go far away. We in the elevators, we can produce energy. In some movements of the elevator, we consume energy, but in some others, we can produce energy. How can we re-inject this energy into the grid is an issue. How can we consume in our building this energy is also a possibility. So really, we find a lot of things in which an elevation company can bring to a smart city.
Okay, thank you. And thanks everyone for your great intros. I think this is going to be a fun one. I think I'd love to start with one of the issues that came up early on, which is this idea of moderating private car ownership. I think we can agree that one of the main goals in making a smarter mobility plan for any city is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And additionally, we've been talking about reducing congestion and making commuting choices more reliable, right? A better idea of how long it takes from getting from point A to point B. So I'd like to ask, and this is kind of for everyone, but there may be some of you who want to jump in first. It's this question of, is the cutting edge of solving mobility issues getting people out of their private vehicles? Is reducing reliance on individually owned automobiles, is that the necessary sort of, was that where we're headed? The conversation in the United States these days is about whether or not there's a sort of shift in our culture with younger people. There's a lot of discussion about peak car in the developed world right now, and especially, and this is something that we've been talking about since really the beginning of the recession. So, not very long, going back to maybe 2008, is that younger people, but we're looking at polls, we're looking at consumer choices, and there seems to be a kind of cultural shift for the millennials, or even generations slightly older than that, that there's maybe a different kind of feeling about whether or not owning your own car is important. But there's also a great deal of skepticism, I would say, about whether that's really true, whether it's a permanent cultural change, whether this is just a fad among the childless, and once we have families with many children, then minivan sales will go right back up. This is something that's a big discussion in the United States, and that at the same time, I think in the developing world, one of the things that Dario mentioned is the rise of the middle class, and I don't get any sense that the desirability of owning your own car has disappeared in the developing world or even parts of the developed. So I'd love to discuss this sort of whether or not this is is this the aim we're going for? Are we trying to change the culture of our cities, and where are we with in terms of, if it is what's happening there? What is the culture changing? Are we having any success in that? Mohinder, I saw you nodding your head, so maybe we'll start with you.
Okay, let me start by just saying a few words about this issue of car culture and whether it's pervasive throughout the world. My sense, I'm not so sure whether in the developed world it's something that is a permanent change, a permanent cultural shift or not. But certainly from the perspective of the developing world, I think the aspiration is still very strong, and as the affluence level of the people go up, I think this desire to own cars, either because it's a symbol that you have arrived somewhere, it's something you need for mobility because of the way the cities are planned. I think this desire is very strong, and I think my sense is if you leave it to technology, say for instance we have electric cars coming on, say in 10, 20 years. Now, does that solve the problem? I don't think so, you see, because whether it's a traffic jam with electric cars or a traffic jam with the gasoline cars, it is still a traffic jam, you see. So technology alone will not be the answer, but it can certainly be an enabler to get to the answer. So the issue is, in terms of changing the car culture in the developing world, I find it difficult to see that world can follow the trajectory that perhaps in the 20th century was followed by, say, the United States of America and other places. So unless transport policy addresses that aspiration in some concrete way through policy measures, to urban development structures, I think it will need to take care of that. So that's my quick response to it.
And of course, Singapore has taken rather drastic measures to address how expensive it is, for example, to buy a car through tax policy. Can you tell us a little bit about some of those policies that?
Okay, there are basically two policies two prongs to the policy to moderate car usage. One is in terms of moderating the ownership, that means the rise of ownership, and we do it through fiscal instruments. We have a system of online public auction bidding for the license to own a vehicle, to own a car in Singapore. So every 2 weeks, people go online to bid for it, and if they bid for it according to the price they pay, then they can buy a car. And that bidding makes the price of cars very expensive in Singapore. Notwithstanding that, like I mentioned earlier, there is still a strong desire to own cars. And we implemented these policies way back in the early days before car ownership had started to rise. So it's something like when car ownership was low, we implemented this policy. which arguably could have been difficult if you had done it much later, maybe 30, 40 years when car ownership has gone up so much, because then it's a case of taking away something from the people, is it? So that's one. The other one is in terms of congestion charging. We started, as I mentioned, with a very simple manual-based system where we cordoned off the city center in 1975 with all the roads with gantries, so that you had to pay a charge which you then put onto your windscreen in order to gain entry to the city center. Now, a city center before that was gridlocked. It was congested terribly, but with that, plus the improvements that we made in public transport, allowed us to make quite a big shift in terms of congestion, reducing congestion in the city center. And then as time went on, we looked at technology, and in 1998, we implemented an electronic road pricing system. Again, it's around the city, a cordon around the city center, but then it allowed us to vary the charges so that during peak hours, the charge is higher, during off-peak, the charge is lower. And it's something that we engaged the people of Singapore, and we set out very clear, publicly announced criteria that we want. The purpose of this electronic road pricing scheme is not to generate revenue for the government, but it's really to manage traffic within the city. So for instance, every 3 months, we carried out speed surveys along the roads into the city center, and if the speed band is within a certain range, then we keep to the charge that we have. But if the speeds drop, so then the charge goes up. So it's a very transparent system that we talk to the people of Singapore to say this is how we do it, and the rationale why we need to do that. So that's probably the two key measures we've done in Singapore. Yeah.
I just think it's fascinating that your impression is that even though Singapore has done almost everything it can to make it very undesirable to purchase your own vehicle, that there's still a strong desire to have it, whether it's a status symbol of adulthood or your economic status, that owning a car is still something that people are looking for. And Dario, I know we talked a little bit about this as well.
Yes, definitely the car needs to be part of a city, but the real problem with cars is trying to get all these cars at the same time of the day to the same place of the city. So at the end, that's what gridlock is about. So owning a car at the end is not the problem, it's using it at the same time to get to work. And we planners in transportation focus too much on the work trip. But nowadays, the work trip is only less than 30% of the total trips made in a day. So if we think about the work trip with public transportation as the main means, because it's getting a lot of people to the same place almost at the same time, and the car for other types of errands, shopping, going, visiting friends, going to other parts of the city or other parts of the country, it's a rational use of a car. So taking this type of measures like Singapore has been very difficult over time, but we now see, thanks to London, which it's a global city and an iconic city, many other cities discussing it, like New York City, not successful, but discussing it, and many other places in Sweden, in Valletta, a small island in the Mediterranean, having congestion pricing as a measure. And we see other measures of demand management like parking management in San Francisco or in Lisbon, which are other ways of making the use of cars more rational. It's not about taking away the car, and the opportunity of having the car is that the individual choice is not the collective good. And that's when
or even
planning,
the individual good, right?
Yeah.
So no, you're not expecting anyone to make a choice about the collective good every day when they're trying.
The individual choices, by summing up individual choices, we ended up in a difficult collective situation. So that's where the role of government plays an important activity. It's trying to find ways through fiscal instruments, to incentives, to economic incentives, which are the most important ones, to rationalize that, and eventually from congestion or parking management fees, getting improvements on the public transport system, which also helps the city moving around, or in non-motorized mobility, better sidewalks, better bike paths, better bike sharing systems. So the people have, it's not just about open choice, because unfortunately, open choice doesn't bring the collective good.
I absolutely agree with you about hopefully the potential promise of parking management and some of the models that we're seeing out of cities like San Francisco. But I think the cities you mentioned that have successfully implemented congestion pricing it's a relatively small number of cities, and
Yes.
we've certainly seen that the political will to implement these kinds of fees in many places, including in New York City, may not be there. Are we not there yet? Is congestion pricing really something that can work in every city? I'm not so sure. Does anybody have a thought about the future of congestion pricing?
I think, so the measure we can take in the cities as congestion pricing, or the restriction we create in cities in order to avoid grid congestions in city center, should always go together with other measures in order to, first one is the young people you mentioned, the education. We cannot only act in the people who know they have a card. We have to make an education in order to promote a rational use of the vehicle. But also, if we create restrictions in the cities, we create another problem. Is usually the cities don't have a public transportation system infrastructure in order to get good service for all these people who want to leave the car at home. So these measures should always go together with other measures in order to make better the public transportation and to create better infrastructures for intermodality, multimodality, and good improve the service for the public transportation.
Yeah, David.
Well, you asked the question, can it work? I think absolutely it can work. That's been demonstrated on a technical basis. The
Sure.
question is how to organize it and how to describe it to people in a way that's a value proposition for everybody, including for the drivers. Now, New York's been mentioned several times as someplace that it did not happen yet, but keep in mind it did not happen in Stockholm the first time they asked either. Stockholm, it needed to be tried and then put again before the voters in a plebiscite. They only approved it, they didn't approve it prospectively as an idea. They only approved it once they had seen the true value. Now in New York, it actually, and Mayor Bloomberg deserves a lot of credit. Of course, he's very interested in technology and the wise use of limited resources and innovation in government. So it's really to his credit that he proposed this, and it actually got quite far considering the multi-layered nature of the governance structure in the United States. Within the city of New York, it was supported by the labor unions and the business organizations, the major newspapers, and the elected city council, as well as obviously the mayor who had proposed.
But of course, that's not enough, right?
That's actually a pretty remarkable success. Yeah. The only reason it was not implemented was for failure of a vote in the state legislature, which controls what the city can do, even though the city is the entity that controls the streets. Because of the governance structure in New York State, the state legislature would have had to approve it, and they didn't want to take a vote because it was controversial. I think the lessons to be learned are not technical ones, as Mohinder said, that technology is there. The real key is building the political and financial consensus that documents, as Mohinder said, where the proceeds are going. That if the proceeds are going to provide more transportation choices and improve the maintenance on the bridges, and the public understands those funds are going to something that benefits them, that's a very different type of situation than if they think the money is just coming out of their pocket and disappearing. If they then recognize they're going to have a more reliable system, that there's a value to that they're willing to pay for. And finally, you have to also remind them we're paying for congestion now.
Yes.
We're just paying for it with our time.
Yes.
And it's the limited capacity on the road. It is being rationed, but it's just not being rationed in an economical way for any particular outcome. It's being rationed randomly by the traffic, and the money is going up in smoke and the time on our watch while we're sitting there. So you have to say, well, you're already paying today, but wouldn't you rather pay in a more rational way and get some good things out of it? Then it becomes much more saleable.
Yes, can I just comment on Alejandro's point? I think I absolutely agree with you that you cannot just tackle one side of the problem, that means manage private transport demand, but very importantly, you need to look at what is the alternative, and in that case, public transport is the alternative. And here, you're looking at enhancing not just the MRT line itself, I mean, building the line, but you're looking at the total journey experience from the moment you leave your house until you reach your office or wherever you're going. And so feeder systems become very important. I think that's the point you mentioned. But I think one of the things that we also realize, and this as we develop the transport system, is the role of walking. Role of walking as to the MRT stations, and how to enhance it from the climate, to protect yourself from the climate. So we engage, for instance, in Singapore in a very extensive covered walkway program so that people can actually easily walk. They don't need to take another feeder, because once you start taking a feeder, you have the issue of reliability of the feeder and all that. So if you can enhance the walking experience, that is something which it's very important, we think, yeah.
Do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, I used to walk a lot when I was young. I used to walk to school every day and walk back. It was a 10-minute journey each way, and used to dream about having a car. And ironic, isn't it? Now I'd actually love to just have a 10-minute walk to the office. I think demographics do have something to play on this. I think choice as well is also a big factor. And to just sort of pick up on your point, what you're really describing is, in the technical jargon, multimodal journeys. And you walk a little bit, you take a bus, and then you maybe walk again to the office or to your meeting. Laying on some of these choices, I think, is really an important part, and from policymakers, giving those choices, alternatives, and integrating those into the transport mix is something that can bring beneficial results. Some smaller, medium-sized cities have started to look at that. In Strasbourg, for instance, there are now bicycle hire stations strategically located next to major tramways, tram stations. And you can measure now the use of those different forms of transport. 30% of all journeys today in Strasbourg are by bike, simply because planning strategically where to put them, where to locate them next to the main tram stations has given people that option. And oddly enough, if it's available and it works, we'll start using it more. So, I'd love to swap my car for a bus and a bike. Give me the chance to do that, and I can relive my youth a little bit and stretch my legs, walk.
Yeah, I would like to come back to this multimodal transportation because I think it's one of the keys for succeeding in this issue. When we are moving people from A to B, at the end we have a real transportation chain made of several rings of different transportation ways. One can be walking, plus public transportation, plus car, and so on. At the end of the day, the perception of the citizens will be that the quality of this transportation chain will correspond to the poorest ring in this chain. Because we can have a fantastic metro, but if accessing to the metro is difficult, or the car is taking a small jam in 10 minutes from car to the changer station, this will be a mess. So really, we have to think on this chain as a whole, and I think for this the technology is ready. Which brings me to another point. I think the political or the social discussion are in one level. The technology, as you all mentioned, is really ready. And how can we fill the gap? So maybe one of the things is not always trying to design very nice and very comprehensive, complex transportation systems, and go step by step, close to the citizen, and improving in a very small pieces of this transportation chain. Here in Barcelona, we have a lot of examples, and one which is maybe not very well known by people because they use that by thousands of people every day, is in the new L9 line, which is the newest one, goes around 70-meter depth, so there are kinds of dwells with a lot of elevators inside. When the train is coming to the station, the train issues a signal to the elevators, and then the elevators know that the train is coming, so all the elevators close doors, go to the top, to the bottom, and opens the door. So this means when 100, 200 people goes out of the train in this station, 6 elevators are just waiting for them just to go up. So this is the kind of things that is very easy to solve, and it's going to avoid queues, and it's going to avoid very uncomfortable situation for people. And these kinds of things are really ready to implement and to increase the efficiency and also the quality of the overall system.
I completely agree. I think the experience for the user should be independence how many transportation modes I take in my travel. So my perception should be I take one. And I think the problem, and David mentioned that, is the organization in the city. How many authorities we have in a city for organizing public and private transportation? Our experience here in Spain is we have an authority organizing private mobility, and we had at least 2 or 3 authorities planning public transportation: train, underground, buses, bicycle. And where from Indra, for example, we have promoted the first buses priority system here in Spain. So when we're trying to install this system, we saw that the Public Transportation Authority will agree. They saw how many benefits they could obtain for this system, but the responsible of the private organization, private traffic, don't see the benefits, because they thought that promoting or giving priority to public transportation could make works mobility in the city. So I think one of the main challenges the city has is to optimize this organization, to have the same vision to everyone in the city, and to talk, to communicate between each other.
All right, well, let's talk about that a little bit more, too. I think one of the things that we all talked about when we were planning this discussion was this idea that there are sort of transportation specialists out there trying to get the message out that we need to have more reliable transportation choices for citizens, that the technology is there, but we need to come together and have a plan. But you know, what I'm curious to ask all of you is you know, I think that transportation does not exist in a vacuum. You know, it is absolutely tied to land use planning. It is absolutely tied to a number of you know, other departments within government that may not work so closely with the transportation planners, with the private sector, with regional planning groups. And so I'd like to hear a little bit from each of you about some of the other players in this world that the transportation world could be working more closely with or more efficiently with. David?
Well, certainly I think city designers, urban designers have a very big role to play with regard to how transportation works. And often transit agencies, operating transit agencies who run the buses are from a different agency than the entity that actually owns the streets. And all around the world now, there's much greater appreciation for the multiple things that a street needs to be designed to do.
Indeed, the complete street is sort of taken over.
Complete street
yes.
is not just a slab of asphalt or concrete for vehicles to travel on, but it's also a place where economic development has to happen, where there needs to be pedestrian safety and activity, gathering places, and that the throughput function of a street is only one of the things to be considered, but and then within that there are needs for multiple modes of throughput, that safety for the bicyclist and for the pedestrian as well as for the automobile is very important, and that the nodes where all those things come together. So I would say certainly that urban designers, city planners need to be much better integrated with the transportation planners. I think the financial industry also needs to be integrated. Certainly in our country, where we've funded so much of transportation on a fuel tax, which is
that's not a particularly sustainable plan going forward, right?
And it's based on the more fossil fuel that consume, the more revenue there is. But we want fossil fuel consumption to go down. Fuel tax is not paid by people using battery-operated automobiles. So we need to have more creativity in the financing and operation of our transportation system, the revenue flows. And for that innovation, I think we look to the private sector. There needs to be some integration, recognizing these are public services that need to be financed in a different way, not necessarily funded by private sources, but financed in concert with new techniques from the private sector. I think those are some examples of other professions that need to be better integrated, but there's a whole list, including public health professionals. We think of the obesity problem was, mentioned earlier. How much of that is attributable to the fact people are sitting in their automobile instead of walking for 10 minutes? Everybody in the United States walked for 10 minutes. There'd be a tremendous positive impact on public health.
Yeah, regarding that public health, obesity is kind of a problem of this century, and there are 3.2 million people dying every year because of lack of physical activity, dying prematurely. And this opportunity of walk to the bus, walk to the train, it's one of the important things that we can do for ourselves, and it's just there. The World Health Organization has been looking at this issue very, very, very specifically, and had found that is an opportunity of using the walking, the utilitarian walking, as part of your weekly exercise. But there's another health very, very important issue, and is the issue of road safety. 1.3 million people dying every year in traffic accidents around the world, and mainly in urban areas is the conflict between cars that traffic engineers want to speed up, and pedestrians that are not protected or not protected to cross safely in many intersections, especially in the developing world. And the third issue in health is the issue of air quality, which goes to the tailpipe of the vehicles, and it's very important. So when we start tying different professions, different areas, public health, planning, traffic engineering, transit planning, and then start collecting the needs of the people directly and trying to address the needs of the people, we start thinking in a different way, moving people, providing access in a safe, healthy way, and not just speeding cars around.
I wonder whether there's another sort of allied question to all of this, which is, in terms of the sort of choices, changes, switches we're talking about here, let's just step back a little bit and ask ourselves, how long do we expect those choices to sort of be made? How long are they going to take to actually take effect? Are we talking about changing what we do tomorrow, next week? Or is it over a decade or maybe 2 decades that we expect this slow shift, this slow diversification of transport modes? And I want, looking at some of the cities we've worked with, you're talking decades, 20 years in some cases, where people have put in place the initial measures, initial building blocks, and recently incrementally adding to that, adding EVs, adding bicycle hire. How realistic are we being in terms of the time frames that we expect those changes to be placed? And then the sort of next question is, and how long are you elected for in political office? Because I'm not sure they're actually aligned in terms of time frame. So when we talk about, this is a political discussion ultimately, and we're here as industry participants to that discussion, we need to be mindful of those sorts of time frames, and mindful of the fact that the choices we're asking our buyers to make perhaps giving them some implication, and the time frames those benefits are going to be realised may not always be as quick as we all might hope.
Yeah, coming back to your question, who we should bring into this discussion, I think we shouldn't avoid the citizens themselves. So it's now very easy to have their opinion, their direct opinion in real time, massive opinion with open innovation duties or even social networks, which is fine, okay? But let's not forget, when we are talking about mobility, that the use of social networks is very pretty focused on essentially young people.
This is a certain group of people. Yeah.
So we are facing more and more older people with specific needs of mobility, which normally have little voice and are less here than other groups of people with a higher possibility of communication. This part of the population is extremely sensible to our mobility solutions in big cities. So let's take care and have a broad view of who is really needing and with specific needs in terms of mobility, because also they can have their own impact when you have, I mean, wheelchairs in a walkway, then you have a problem. It's a very micro problem, but you have a problem that can be repeated for a while.
I think it's a very interesting topic, the interaction with the citizens, with the population, over the city, over the social networks. So social networks give government tools in order to promote measures, to promote this cultural change in public transportation, but also in order to give the feedback how these measures are impacting in the population, if they are going in the right direction or not. And if they are not in the right direction, just to change it. Because I think one of the problems 20 years ago was the government, the people in the government thought we should go in one direction, and nobody asked people if this was the right direction. So now we have the tools in order to make this interaction more fluid between citizens and administration, organization and planners. And I think it's a very important topic.
So what sort of tools are you talking about when you say we definitely have them to engage citizens in what directions we should be going in?
So for example, we are working also in pilots here in Barcelona, in Zaragoza, in Spain. We can supervise, for example, Twitters in a city. We can know in real time which is the impression of the people, our measures in mobility we are promoting, and we can know in real time if people are using new measures in mobility, which are the most used routes in mobility, just supervising Twitters. And also the next step is to study the meaning of the Twitter. So nowadays we are supervising where are the people Twitter, in order to know where are the massification of the people, which transportation mode they are taking. But we are working on knowing in real time what the people are saying in social networks, in order to know public transportation incidents or problems, but also if we promote new measures, knowing in real time if these measures are going to be a success or not, and have acceptation by the population, by the people.
David.
It's really important with all these technological tools that we have available now to be very clear about our purpose and why we're using them, and they're very distinct purposes. I think we have the role of citizens as residents and their participation in the planning process, which is a two-way street that enables people in government to take advantage of the knowledge of the local residents. And so when New York City was deciding where to put the bike share station, there's an organization, non-governmental organization called Open Plans in New York City that helped to to develop this platform so that there could be advice from the citizens who know, well, I think there should be a bike station here because I happen to know there's a very popular nightclub there. That is not information that a government official would necessarily think of. So it's sort of the role of the resident in shaping the future. It's not necessarily a very representative group, but that's the role in public policy. But there's a separate role and a separate purpose and application of technology, which is just the citizen as a consumer of the transportation service. And that's a very okay, I want to know my bus is coming in 2 minutes and 12 seconds. I have time to go buy coffee. And that's a matter of the accuracy of the information, and all that has to be founded on the data being open and transparent, because not all of this information will be put out to the public in a way that is usable by the public unless there's some mediation by the developer community and who can help to package the government's data or the transit agency's data with other types of data that's useful to the consumer. Yeah. So I think we just have to keep in mind these are very powerful tools, and we be specific about when we're using them as a means of public policy to solicit advice and provide consultation, and to what extent we're doing it as everyday consumer.
If anything, I think the transportation sector has had a little bit more success in this area of making standardization and open data than maybe other areas. But I absolutely take your point.
It's mixed, and sometimes we don't want you to know the bus is 9 minutes late. We don't want transparency is a difficult thing.
Or transit agencies have been somewhat reluctant to release that data because they think that they might be worth something down the road.
Yeah.
Owen, you were.
Yeah, I was really going to sort of agree and back up what you're saying there, because it's all about technology, isn't it, these days? So we say, but the benefits are how we apply the use of that to making our lives easier. There's a lot of data out in the transport systems. There's petabytes of it every year generated. So as companies, we're starting to do something with that and use that for big data analysis, data mining, and we can work with authorities to help them plan, optimize strategically. But the best example, the most immediate type of public interaction is, it's right now, here, today, what time is my next bus? Can I grab a bike on the other end of the journey? Yeah. And having all that data pushed through into a usable form for us as travelers, through your smartphone or through some other form of interactive display on the street, that's also something we need to really make sure we put in place, because the technology is great, but I think our message really is, we all agree on, let's actually do something useful with it that makes our lives easier. And so, industry's starting to work on those challenges now. Make sure you ask your industrial partners to open those doors for you and not to lock all that in.
Maybe we have time for one last comment before I go to the audience.
I agree with all of you all about the different agencies that come into play when you're doing transportation planning. It's not just the transportation specialist alone. I just wanted to pick one point. That's a quick point. This is in terms of providing information to the people, because eventually, ultimately, you're designing the transportation system for the community. So community engagement, citizen engagement is critical. And here, I think our transportation system must be all inclusive. And you're talking of an aging population, you're talking of young people who get along with technology, who've been born with the smartphones and things like that. And you're talking of the older people. So when you start planning information on how you want to position it out, I think we have to bear in mind the needs and how the different age groups will sort of relate to the technology.
Yeah. Definitely a generational aspect to all of this we haven't quite gotten to yet, but I want to make sure we get questions from the audience, so maybe we'll bring up the house lights just a little bit. There are microphones in the aisles, so if you have a question, please make your way there. There we go, now we can see you.
Yes, good morning, I am Jaime Quezado from Portugal. I'd like to make a question about the engagement of citizens. You spoke about the need that citizens are involved in the questions of mobility. You spoke about the role of government with electronic, but don't you think that there is another kind of ways in terms of giving citizens the necessary information and putting them in the process. For instance, making the best practice more known, or making interactions with universities. I'd like to know about that, eventually Mr. Singh or the other person. Thank you.
Dario? Okay, in that case, I'll start. If I understand your question correctly, you're asking about the best practices, how people learn from one another. And I think that's very, very, very important. One of the things that we do, and that's something that my organization does as well, the LT Academy, is we try to collate the different practices on transport from across the world, and we try to organize the exchange with people from around the world in order to sort of not only to share the knowledge that we collate, but also in terms of how that knowledge can influence our policy development in Singapore. So it's a case of learning from the world and sharing our experience with the world. And I agree with you. I think that's very important, how cities learn from one another, because different cities are at different level of development. Some cities are mature cities, say for the Western European context. Some cities in America are differently designed. The emerging cities have different needs. So once we can start to talk with one another and exchange this knowledge, I think it's very important. Yeah.
Question over here.
Yeah, I'm Chris Bird from Qualcomm. I'm co-author of the book Reinventing the Automobile, Personal Urban Mobility for the 21st Century. And I have a question regarding the development of autonomous vehicles, which hasn't been mentioned, but has, I think, a tremendous implication for mobility in maybe 10, 15 years' time. It has the potential to do a lot of good for providing mobility for disabled people and older people who may not have personal mobility today, but it may create some additional challenges in terms of urban sprawl and reshape parking infrastructure. So I wanted to get your thoughts on where you think the development of autonomous vehicles and the introduction of autonomous vehicles, how it might reshape the cities and how people move around in the future, and encourage car sharing programs, for example. Because I think it has huge implications, and it's impossible, I guess, at this point to know if they're positive or negative for the city. But I'd like.
Oh, you want to dive in?
You take it. Well, I may say that in technology there are many things that we will be using in 10 years' time that we don't know them yet. But coming from the developing world, when we start hearing about autonomous vehicles and other things, when we don't have the basic means of mobility for a large portion of the population, it seems like, oh, this is a problem, this is a solution chasing a problem, not the other way around. We need to, in the developing world, in Latin America, in Africa, in the developing countries of Asia, to solve basic mobility needs. The people, it's only having less than 1 trip a day, when here in Europe the people do 3 or 3.5 trips per day. So solving the basic mobility need, it's something we need a lot to focus on. And probably these new technologies like the autonomous vehicle will help in that direction. But probably, my feeling from my perspective is that there's a lot to be done before we move into these very interesting, challenging technology topics that may be part of the discussion in the industrialized world.
I'll just jump in. I would think, obviously that you're right. I think the time frame is still a ways off, but the technology is getting there. And for me, living in a city where there's been a lot of experimentation from the entrepreneurial side on, car hailing services on cell phones, I think autonomous vehicles could be fantastically interesting in that respect, in terms of potentially maybe even reducing the number in fleets that cities might need, in terms of not just car sharing, but really sort of ride hailing. But certainly car sharing as well, that that there are clearly tremendous opportunities for scale, really scaling down the number of cars that a city might need if everyone is able to, click a button on their phone and call for an autonomous vehicle that shows up, that's whichever one is closest and available. I think I'm supremely interested in sort of what the merging of those two technologies might mean at the city level in really getting to that goal of having fewer cars on the road. Obviously, the efficiencies there are fantastic. Question over here.
Yes, it's Yaspuru from Tecnalia. Yeah, I'm going back to the need of changing the culture about the car and about how we go from one place to the other. And I know that it's not a war against the car companies, but it's true that it's a competition. We have to think about that. So my question is why we are not. I don't know if we do or we do in enough effort on involving communication experts, publicity experts, and marketing experts, because the private car companies, they are putting a lot of effort on that, and there are a lot of different companies telling to us that we are very, very with clear messages. We are better if we have a car, and even some messages against the public transport. So we can see some advertising putting the bikes like a danger or saying that the public transport is worse. So why not to do an international campaign, putting all the efforts of different public administration together to do an international campaign saying clear messages about public transport, not only green, but only saving time. That's important. That's also very important, and the people will consider that. So why not to do that? And saying about the messages of public transport, this idea of saving times, this is a very good point of the public transport. We can do things if we in the time of going from one place to the other, if we are not driving. Why we are allowing the cars, allowing us driving less safe, because we can do things when we are driving. So why there's a big debate about the use of different tools when you are driving. So, and this is less safe, and of course the public transport can do it better. So why not to do an international thing about that? Thanks.
About the first point, about the publicity or marketing campaigns promoting public transportation, I think it's a good idea, but should be the second step. So if we want people leave the car at home, we need to give a really good public transportation. Give people a reward for using public transportation. And this reward should be cost, should be time, and should be efficiency. If we don't have these 3 points in public transportation, people is not going to leave the car at home. So when we achieve these objectives, then we can promote with marketing, with campaigns, public transportation usage. But first, we have to take the necessary actions in order to have a good public transportation.
Yeah, I certainly agree with that. I think the value and effectiveness of any advertising campaign varies in relation to its truth. And that if the bus service is not frequent, it doesn't matter. You can advertise, well, it comes every 45 minutes, it's still not a good product. Yeah. I think we have a lot more to do on product development. But when we look at what the automobile promised, the values and that it appeals to in people, it's the flexibility, it's the freedom. That's what car companies advertise on television. The reality of that becomes very different, and those same values can apply to non-automotive transportation when all the modes work together. The flexibility of a lifestyle. Certainly an urban lifestyle in New York City, where I live now, a car is actually a burden. It's not freedom. My freedom exists in the fact that there are subway stations near my house and 24-hour service going in multiple directions.
And now bike share and many other options.
Bike sharing. And I think that's what's very exciting about the whole open data and the app developers, who are in effect the best advertisements in a very practical sense of making all these forms of urban mobility more discernible and legible to the public.
Yeah. Well, I think you're going to have the last word. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, and I'm sorry we didn't get to all the audience questions. But I hope you'll join me in thanking the panel, and thanks for a great discussion.